The dress was snow white, with golden embroidery along the sleeves, and Molly had spent 3 weeks sewing every stitch by candlelight. It was not the kind of dress a border guard's daughter should have. It was the kind of dress a woman wears when she believes, against all logic and against every warning life has already given her, that something good is about to happen, that this time will be different, that this time someone will look at her and see what is truly there. Molly adjusted the fabric over her shoulders as the carriage passed through the iron gates of Veldmore Court, and felt her heart climb into her throat, as if it knew, before she did, what was coming. Veldmore Court was everything the rumors had promised, and a little more. Walls of black stone rising higher than the eye could comfortably follow. Torches mounted on wrought iron brackets casting orange light across corridors that seemed to have no end. The smell was of burning resin, aged leather, and something deeper and older beneath both. The scent of powerful packs gathered in one place, each one carrying its own territory embedded in the skin of its wolves. She stepped down from the carriage holding the hem of her dress with cold fingers. Behind her, Cora climbed down immediately and stood beside her without saying anything, only pressing her shoulder briefly against Molly's. Cora had been the first person to see the finished dress, had run her fingers over the golden embroidery with an expression that mixed admiration and quiet worry, and had said only, "You deserve for this to go well." It was the only thing that needed to be said. The great hall was full. Molly had never seen so many wolves from different packs, gathered in a single space. There were representatives from at least 12 territories, recognizable by the crests embroidered on their cloaks, by the tooth and bone collars some wore as symbols of rank, by the ritual markings visible on the hands and necks of the older wolves. The banquet tables ran parallel along the length of the hall, loaded with roasted meats, dark bread, and pitchers of red wine that scented the air with tannin and dark berry. At the far end, on a raised stone platform, sat a chair that was not quite a throne, but clearly functioned as one. Empty. Molly searched the room for Dorian's face. Dorian Vess was the son of the Alpha of the Grey Pine Pack, and he had promised her, 3 moons ago, that on this night, he would present her before the gathered packs as his chosen one. He had said it, with his hand over her heart, with his eyes steady on hers, with that voice that sounded more convincing than it should have. She had believed him because she wanted to believe, because it was easier to believe than to admit she had learned to read the wrong signs. She found him near the second table, his back to her, and beside him, her hand resting on his arm, stood Sina Varthon, daughter of the Alpha of the Red Oak Pack. Tall, dark-haired to the waist, dressed in deep wine and gold, smiling at Dorian with the ease of someone who had already decided that space belonged to her. Molly stopped walking. Cora placed a hand gently against her back, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Dorian turned as if he had felt her gaze, and for a moment his eyes met hers across the hall. There was no surprise on his face. There was something worse. Relief. The kind of relief that belongs to someone who has made a difficult decision and is glad they no longer need to explain it. He approached with Sina still beside him, and Molly stayed where she was because her legs had decided entirely on their own, not to move. "Molly." His voice was low and controlled. "I had to make a decision that is better for my pack. Sina and I, the alliance between our families makes sense in a way I cannot ignore. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry. There were people nearby. Not many, but enough. Enough for Molly to know that at least 5 pairs of eyes were watching the scene with the careful attention of those who pretend not to be listening, but miss nothing. She felt the heat rise to her face. Felt the snow-white dress with its golden embroidery grow suddenly heavy in a way it had never felt while she was sewing each stitch by candlelight, imagining this exact moment as something entirely different, but she did not cry. That, at least, she could control. "That's fine." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Take care of yourself, Dorian." She turned before he could say anything more. Before Sina could say anything, because there was a smile beginning at the corners of that woman's lips that Molly had no intention of witnessing. She walked toward the side exit of the hall with her head up and her shoulders back, because the only dignity still available to her was her posture, and she was not going to surrender that. Cora followed in silence. The side corridor was colder than the hall, the stone walls exhaling the damp chill of the night outside. The torches here were more sparse, casting long shadows between the stone arches. Molly walked until she reached the first arch that opened onto an inner courtyard, stopped, and finally let her shoulders fall. It was not crying. It was only the weight leaving from somewhere. He never deserved the dress. Cora's voice was firm and clear in the quiet of the corridor. I know. Molly ran her fingers along the golden stitching on her sleeve. I know that. It was exactly then that they heard the footsteps, not the kind of footsteps that go unnoticed. The kind that change the air before the person walking even appears. As if the space itself knows in advance that something of weight is approaching, and adjusts the temperature, the pressure, the silence accordingly. 3 men turned into the corridor from the opposite end. The first was broad-shouldered and red-haired, with an expression that seemed divided between boredom and amusement, like someone who finds almost everything funny, but rarely bothers to explain why. He wore a thick cloak bearing the crest of a pack Molly didn't immediately recognize, though it was clearly from somewhere with enough power that the man walked as if Veldmore's corridors belonged to him personally. The second was taller, sharp-featured, with a smile that appeared at the corner of his mouth the moment his eyes landed on her, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for permission to exist, and clearly never has. The third was not smiling. He was the tallest of the 3, with shoulders that filled the black cloak as if the fabric had been measured for every angle of his body, dark hair, an unreadable face, eyes that were such a deep shade of brown they appeared black in the torchlight. He did not look at her the way the other 2 did, with open curiosity, or the slightly performed interest of men who want to be noticed noticing. He looked at her differently. The way someone looks when they recognize something. The way someone looks when they have been waiting to find a thing, in some moment, in some place, and are simply confirming that the moment has arrived. Molly stood still. The red-haired man spoke first, stopping a few paces from her with his thumbs hooked into his belt. You came from the direction of the main hall. It was not a question. And you're standing in a cold side corridor away from the feast. That usually means one of 2 things. It usually means someone did something stupid. The second one finished, still with the smile at the corner of his mouth, tilting his head slightly toward her in a greeting that was simultaneously polite and entirely free of formality. Based on the dress, I'd say you're not the stupid one in this story. Cora, beside Molly, drew a slow breath. The third had still not spoken, but his eyes had not left her since he turned into the corridor. Molly raised her chin. Do you always stop to question women in corridors? Or only when you're bored with the banquet? The red-haired man let out a short and genuine laugh. The second raised an eyebrow with an expression that clearly said interesting. The third finally moved, 1 step ahead of the other 2, and when he did, the air in the corridor did something strange. It condensed. It grew heavier, the way it does before a storm when the pressure shifts and animals go quiet. Molly felt his scent before she understood she was feeling it. Deep wood, cedar, something that recalled wet earth after rain, and beneath all of that, something nameless that made something ancient inside her go completely still, as if it recognized a frequency it had not known it carried. Adrian. The name came out of the red-haired man's mouth like a mildly amused warning. You're frightening the woman. Adrian did not turn toward him. His eyes remained on Molly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and carried the kind of weight that belongs to someone who has never needed to raise it to be obeyed. What is your name? The corridor went silent. Even Cora stopped breathing for a moment. Molly looked at him directly and felt, with a clarity she could not explain and had not asked for, that the question was not a small one. That this man did not ask small questions. That when he wanted to know something, it was because he had already decided the answer mattered. Molly. She said her own name with the same steadiness she had used to say that's fine to Dorian, but this time the steadiness required no effort. Molly from nowhere in particular. Something moved across his face, too quickly to be named, but it moved. I know every place, Adrian said, and there was something in those words that sounded less like arrogance and more like a promise. None of them would do you justice. The red-haired man introduced himself as Rowan. He did it the way he seemed to do most things, without waiting for an invitation, with a slight grin that suggested he found his own existence mildly entertaining. The sharp-featured one was called Emmett, and he offered his name with a small incline of his head that was almost a bow, but stopped just short of one. as if full formality was something he had decided long ago was beneath him. Adrian offered nothing further than what he had already given. He stood slightly apart from the other two, not physically distant, but separated by something less tangible, a quality of stillness that made the space around him feel different from the space around everyone else. His eyes had moved from Molly's face only once, briefly, when Rowan had spoken, and had returned to her immediately after, with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry and had no intention of pretending otherwise. Molly was 23 years old and had spent most of those years learning to be invisible in rooms where she didn't belong. She knew how to make herself smaller, how to occupy less space, make less sound, require less attention. It was a skill she had developed the way most useful skills are developed, out of necessity, out of the particular kind of loneliness that comes from growing up on the edges of a world that has its center somewhere you are not. Standing in that cold corridor with those three men looking at her, she found she had forgotten how to be invisible entirely. "We should go back inside," Cora said quietly, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to sound casual and not quite succeeding. "You're welcome to," Emmett said pleasantly, his eyes moving to Cora with an expression of polite interest, though I'd argue the corridor has become considerably more interesting than the banquet. Cora looked at Molly. Molly looked at Adrian. Adrian was still looking at her. "The Grey Pine boy," he said. It was not phrased as a question, but it functioned as one. Molly felt the words land somewhere they had no business landing, which was in the center of her chest, where the embarrassment from earlier was still sitting like an ember she hadn't yet decided what to do with. "That's not really your concern," she kept her voice even. "No," Adrian agreed. And then, after a pause that felt deliberately placed, "But it will be." Rowan made a sound that was almost a cough and was definitely a suppressed laugh. Emmett looked at the ceiling with the serene expression of a man pretending he was somewhere else. Molly squared her shoulders. "I don't know who you are," she said, which was partly true. She knew the name. She had heard it spoken in the same way people speak names that carry weight, carefully, briefly, as if saying them too loudly might summon something. Adrian Crest, the Alpha King, the ruler of Veldmore and every territory that answered to it, which was most of them. She had heard the name the way she had heard stories of winter storms and deep forest and old power, as something that existed in a realm entirely separate from her own life. And yet here he was, in a corridor, looking at her as if she were the thing he had come to Veldmore to find. "You know who I am," he said. And there was no arrogance in it, just the simple recognition of a fact. "I know the title," Molly said. "I don't know you." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as a smile but had different furniture. "That," he said, "is the first honest thing anyone has said to me in this court tonight." Rowan leaned against the wall beside him with his arms crossed, watching the exchange with the undisguised appreciation of someone watching a particularly good match. Emmett had stopped pretending to look at the ceiling and was now watching openly, with the focused attention of a man recalibrating something. Cora moved slightly closer to Molly, which Molly appreciated without acknowledging. "The feast will continue for several more hours," Adrian said, and the shift in his tone was subtle, but present, the formal edge returning in a way that felt like a door being held open rather than closed. "You should not spend them in a corridor." "I was leaving," Molly said. "I know." His eyes moved briefly to the embroidery on her sleeve. The golden thread caught the torchlight, and for a second it glowed, and something in the quality of his attention sharpened in a way she felt rather than saw. "Stay." It was a single word, not a command, though it could have been one from a man with his authority. It was something closer to a request delivered by someone who was not accustomed to making requests, and was doing it anyway, carefully, as if the word itself was unfamiliar in his mouth. Molly should have said no. She had a very clear list of reasons to say no, beginning with the obvious fact that she had just been publicly set aside by a man she had trusted, and ending with the equally obvious fact that standing in a corridor accepting invitations from the Alpha King of Veldmore was not the kind of thing that ended simply. She said nothing for a moment, then she said, 1 hour. Rowan straightened from the wall. Excellent. The banquet hall looked different the second time she entered it. Or perhaps she was the one who was different. She walked in beside Cora, with Adrian slightly behind her, and to her left, and Rowan and Emmett forming a loose perimeter that was casual enough to not look deliberate, and structured enough that every wolf in the room with any instinct at all would understand exactly what it meant. Which was all of them. Every head that turned as they crossed the threshold was turning, because every wolf in that hall could feel the shift in the air, the particular gravity that follows Adrian Crest when he moves through a room. And he was moving through it, toward a table in the center. Toward her. Molly kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral, and told herself very firmly that her heart was beating at a perfectly normal pace. Across the hall, she saw Dorian. He had noticed. Of course he had. His eyes found her through the crowd, and the expression on his face was something she had not expected, and was not entirely prepared for, which was confusion, genuine, unguarded confusion, as if the scene in front of him did not compute, as if the version of Molly he had constructed in his mind did not include this particular possibility. Sina was saying something to him. He wasn't listening. Molly looked away. She sat at the table and found that a cup of wine appeared in front of her with the silent efficiency of staff, who understood which guests required immediate attention. Cora sat beside her and leaned close enough to murmur, "I need you to explain what is happening. I genuinely cannot," Molly murmured back. Adrian sat across from her, not beside her, which she noticed. Across, where he could see her face, which she also noticed, and then immediately told herself she was reading too much into the seating arrangement of a man who had probably not thought about it at all. "You're from the border territories," he said. Not a question. "My father was a border guard for the Ashvin Pack," she said. "He died 2 winters ago. And your mother?" "Before him." Adrian absorbed this without visible reaction, which was somehow less cold than it might have been, and more like the response of someone who understood that certain information deserves to be received without performance. "You made the dress yourself," he said. Molly looked up. "How do you know that?" "The stitching on the left sleeve is slightly tighter than the right." His eyes moved to the sleeve briefly, then back to her face. Someone sewing for themselves pulls differently on their dominant side. It's not a flaw. It's a signature. The table was not entirely quiet around them. Rowan was already deep in conversation with someone from a neighboring pack, his laugh carrying easily over the general noise. Emmett was eating with the focused appreciation of a man who had strong opinions about food and was pleased with the current selection. But the small radius between Molly and Adrian had a different quality to it. Quieter. More deliberate. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured slightly at the space between them. "You don't know me. An hour ago I was no one in a corridor." "An hour ago," Adrian said, his voice dropping just enough that the words were for her and no one else. "You walked out of a hall where someone had just humiliated you, and you did it with your head up and your shoulders back and your voice completely steady." He paused. "I have sat in that hall for 12 years. I have watched wolves with armies behind them fold under far less." Molly held his gaze and said nothing. "You asked why," he said. "That is why." Across the hall, Dorian was still watching, but Molly had stopped looking in that direction entirely. The feast lasted well past midnight. Molly had not intended to stay that long. She had said 1 hour and meant it, had fully planned to rise from the table at the appropriate moment, collect Cora, and return to the modest quarters they had been assigned in the eastern wing of the court, the section reserved for guests of no particular rank, where the beds were narrow and the fireplace smoked, and no one came to refill your cup unless you went looking for them. She stayed 3 hours, not because she was persuaded, not because anyone asked her to remain past the hour she had agreed to. She stayed because the conversation moved the way certain rivers move, without obvious effort, finding the natural course of things, and by the time she noticed how much time had passed, the candles on the table had burned down considerably, and Cora had fallen asleep sitting upright against the wall behind her, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to waiting. Adrian did not speak constantly. That was the thing she noticed first, and then kept noticing, because it was unusual in her experience of men who held power. Most of them filled silence the way they filled rooms, with presence and noise, and the particular energy of someone performing their own importance. Adrian did not perform. He asked questions, and then listened to the answers with the complete attention of someone who had asked because he genuinely wanted to know, and he offered his own words carefully, as if he had thought about them before releasing them. He told her about Veldmore, not its history or its politics, but small things. The way the stone of the eastern tower changed color in winter, going from black to something closer to gray-blue when the frost settled in. The particular quality of silence in the great library on the upper floor, which he had visited almost every night for the last decade when the court was asleep. The fact that the cook, a woman named Berta who had worked the kitchens for 30 years, made a specific bread with rosemary and sea salt that was available only on feast nights, and that he had learned long ago to secure a portion early in the evening because it disappeared within the first hour without exception. Molly found herself talking in return. Not about Dorian, not about the corridor or the dress or the ember still sitting in her chest. About other things. About her father and the border territory, the way the forest sounded at the edge of the Ashfin lands in early morning, the specific gray light that came through the trees before sunrise when the mist was heavy and the world smelled of pine and cold earth and everything was very still. About the 3 seasons she had spent working in the healing house of the pack, learning to identify plants and prepare remedies, because it was useful, and because it gave her hands something to do, and because the healer, an older woman named Sable, had told her she had good instincts for it. Healing, Adrian said, with the quality of attention that meant he was cataloging the information, rather than simply receiving it. Basic healing, she corrected. I'm not trained. I just learned what I could. Sable of Ashfin, he said. She trained under the last court healer of Veldmore before he died. She knows more than most formally trained healers in the Eastern Territories. Molly looked at him. If she taught you, he said simply, you are not as untrained as you believe. It was not flattery. It was delivered with the same tone he used for everything else, level and direct, as if he were stating something he considered a simple fact, rather than a kindness, which somehow made it land differently than flattery would have. Rowan dropped back into the seat beside Adrian at some point past the second hour, returning from whatever conversation had occupied him across the hall with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully extracted useful information from multiple sources. The Grey Pine delegation is leaving early, he said, helping himself to wine without ceremony. Tomorrow morning. Apparently, there was some internal disagreement about the alliance announcement. He said this to Adrian, but his eyes moved briefly to Molly with an expression that was not unkind. Rowan, she was beginning to understand, was the kind of man who paid attention to more than he'd let on and said less than he had noticed. That's nothing to do with me, Molly said. Of course not, Rowan agreed pleasantly, just making conversation. Emmett reappeared to Molly's left and set a small plate in front of her without explanation. On it was a portion of bread, golden and fragrant, with visible rosemary pressed into the crust. Berta's rosemary bread, he said. Last piece. I had to negotiate for it. You stole it, Rowan said. I negotiated, Emmett repeated with dignity. Molly looked down at the bread and felt something loosen in her chest, not the ember, that was still there. Something around it. Some tight outer layer that had been holding since the corridor, since before the corridor, since she had stepped out of the carriage holding her hem with cold fingers, and believed very briefly that the night was going to be something it turned out not to be. She broke off a piece of the bread, and it was warm and slightly salty, and the rosemary was exactly right, and she thought very firmly about nothing in particular for a moment. When she looked up, Adrian was watching her with that same expression she had first seen in the corridor. The recognition. The certainty of someone confirming something they had already decided was true. What? She said. Nothing, he said. She found out who he truly was in the way information like that usually arrives in courts. Not through formal announcement, but through accumulated detail, through the way the room organized itself around him, through the way even the most powerful wolves in the hall angled their bodies slightly toward him when he spoke. The involuntary deference of those who have spent enough time around real authority that their instincts respond to it before their minds do. She had known the title. Alpha King, ruler of Veldmore, and the 7 territories that answered to it. She had known this the way she knew most things about the upper strata of the pack world, abstractly, as information that applied to a reality she had no access to. Sitting across from him and watching the hall move around him like water around a stone, she began to understand the difference between knowing something and understanding it. What she had not known, what no one had mentioned in whatever sparse information she had gathered about tonight, was that he was unmated. Rowan mentioned it with characteristic casualness, somewhere in the 3rd hour, in the middle of a conversation about territorial boundaries that Molly had been following with half her attention. The Eastern packs have been pushing the question again, Rowan said, refilling his cup. third formal inquiry this season about succession. They want to know there's an heir. They want to know there's a mate. There will be, Adrian said, with the tone of someone closing a subject. When? Emmett asked, with the tone of someone who knew the subject would not stay closed. When I decide. The court has been waiting for 12 years. Rowan's voice was easy, conversational, carrying no edge. He was not challenging. He was simply, in his particular way, telling the truth. They have run out of patience in a polite direction. Adrian said nothing. His eyes, which had drifted toward the far end of the hall during this exchange, moved back to Molly. She held his gaze steadily and said, "You don't need to look at me when they say things like that. I'm not looking at you because of what they said," he replied. The fire in the great hearth at the end of the hall shifted, throwing new light across the room, and in that moment, Molly became aware that the night had changed in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Something had settled into a different arrangement. She could feel it the way wolves feel pressure changes in the air, below the level of thought, in the body before the mind. Cora woke up behind her with a small, startled sound, looked around, and then looked at Molly with wide eyes that asked approximately 15 questions simultaneously. Molly shook her head slightly. Later. "It's late," she said to Adrian, to the table, to the general situation. "It is," he agreed. She rose, and the table rose with her in a way that was not dramatic, but was unmistakable. Rowan straightened. Emmett set down his cup. Adrian stood. And when he did, the quality of stillness he carried with him intensified briefly, like a held breath. "Your quarters are in the eastern wing," he said. It was not a question. He knew. "They will be moved tomorrow." Molly looked at him. "To where?" "Somewhere warmer," he said, "with a fireplace that works." It was such a specific and practical thing to say that it caught her completely unprepared, and she laughed before she could decide whether to. A short, genuine sound that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Something in his face changed when she laughed, very slightly, like a room that has been closed for a long time, and someone has opened a window in it. "Good night, Molly from nowhere in particular," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment. "Good night, Adrian of everywhere." She turned and walked toward the corridor with Cora beside her, and she did not look back, and the ember in her chest had changed into something she did not yet have a name for, but that burned considerably warmer. Behind her, she heard Rowan say, quietly, and with great satisfaction, "Well," and heard Adrian say nothing at all, which, she was beginning to learn, was how he said the most important things. The new quarters were in the southern tower. Molly discovered this the following morning when a woman knocked on the door of the narrow eastern wing room before sunrise, introduced herself as Petra, said she was one of the court's household staff, and began folding Molly's things into a traveling chest with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been given a task and intended to complete it before breakfast. "This is unnecessary," Molly said, sitting up in the narrow bed with her hair loose and her dignity only partially assembled. "The king's orders?" Petra said pleasantly, and continued folding. Cora, in the adjacent bed, watched this from under her blanket with an expression of profound interest and said nothing, which was loudly communicative in its own right. The southern tower room was not large, but it was entirely different in quality from everything in the eastern wing. The stone walls were hung with tapestries in deep green and brown, depicting forests and running wolves and the particular kind of landscape that suggested old power and deep territory. The fireplace worked. There was a window seat with an actual cushion, and the window itself looked out over the inner courtyard where the morning light came in at an angle that turned the frost on the stone silver. Molly stood in the middle of it for a moment after Petra left, with Cora beside her, and neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then Cora said, "The Alpha King moved your room, I know. Because your fireplace smoked, that's what he said." "Molly." "I know," Molly said again, more quietly. She knew. She was not a woman who misread things, or at least she had believed she wasn't, before Dorian, before the dress, before 3 weeks of candlelight stitching that had ended in a cold corridor. She was trying to be careful with what she allowed herself to understand. She was trying to hold the information loosely, without weight, without the particular gravity of hope, which she had recently learned was heavier than it appeared, but the room was warm, and the window light was silver, and something about both of those things made careful very difficult. She saw Dorian once more before his delegation left. It was not planned. She was crossing the inner courtyard in the mid-morning, having found that the southern tower had its own access to the outside, and that the courtyard was mostly quiet at that hour, with only a few stable hands moving between the outbuildings and the smell of hay and horses mixing with the cold air. She had wanted 10 minutes of outside and sky and the particular silence of a space that had no social requirements. Dorian was crossing from the opposite direction, clearly heading toward the main gate where his delegation's carriages were being prepared. They saw each other at the same moment. He stopped. She did not. She kept her pace even, and her direction unchanged, because the courtyard was wide enough that their paths would not intersect, unless one of them altered course, and she had no intention of altering course. Molly. He said her name from a few meters away, with the tone of someone who had prepared something to say, and was uncertain whether the moment had arrived. She stopped. Not because she owed him the stop, because she was 23 years old, and she had spent a long time being the person who kept walking and swallowed things down and moved on before she was ready, and she was finding that she was no longer interested in that particular habit. She turned to face him. He looked, she thought, like someone who had spent the night revising a version of events. There were shadows under his eyes, and his jaw was set in the way of someone holding something tense. "What happened last night?" he began. "Was your choice," she said. "I know." "I didn't expect—" He stopped. Started again. "I didn't know you knew anyone at court. I didn't know you had connections here." Molly looked at him for a moment. "I didn't," she said. "I don't. I know a corridor and a cold hour and someone who asked my name." Something moved through his expression that she recognized, because she had felt a version of it herself. The particular discomfort of understanding that a calculation you made was wrong, that you misjudged something in a direction you cannot now correct. "The alliance with Sina's family is important," he said. "It matters for the pack. It was never about Dorian." She said his name quietly, without heat. "I hope the alliance serves your pack well." "I genuinely do." She meant it. That was the part that surprised her slightly, how completely she meant it. The ember that had sat in her chest since the night before had burned through something in the night. And what remained was not bitterness, it was something cleaner, something that felt, unexpectedly, like the particular relief of a weight being set down. She turned and continued across the courtyard. She did not look back this time either. And this time it required no effort at all. The formal court assembly convened at midday. Molly had not been required to attend. She was a guest of no particular rank, with no pack representation, and no official standing in the assembly of alphas and their delegates that gathered in the great hall to address territorial matters and court business. She had fully intended to spend the assembly in the southern tower with the window seat and the silver light, and a volume she had borrowed from the shelf near the fireplace. She attended because Petra appeared at her door 1 hour before it began, and laid out a dress. Not the snow-white dress with the golden embroidery, a different one. Deep blue, the color of the sky in the last moment before full dark, with silver thread along the collar and cuffs that caught light the way water catches it, moving and alive. It was the kind of dress that had clearly been made by someone who knew what they were doing, and had access to materials that cost more than Molly had ever spent on anything in her life. "I can't wear this," Molly said. "The king's orders," Petra said, and smoothed the skirt with one hand in a way that suggested the conversation was finished. Cora, from the window seat, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was entirely too knowing. The assembly hall was arranged differently from the banquet configuration. The long tables had been cleared and replaced with a semicircular arrangement of heavy chairs, each bearing the crest of a pack, positioned to face the central platform where Adrian's chair sat. The alphas and their senior wolves were already seated when Molly entered with Petra, who guided her with quiet efficiency to a position along the side wall, in a reserved section that was not the floor, but was not exactly the gallery either. A middle space, visible but not central. She was aware of the eyes that moved to her as she settled into place. She was aware of Sina Varthon, seated in the Red Oak Pack section with her father, whose eyes found Molly with an expression of sharp assessment that had nothing warm in it. She was aware of Rowan, positioned near the platform, who caught her eye and offered a slight nod that communicated something between acknowledgement and encouragement. She was aware, most of all, of the moment Adrian entered. He came through the main doors at the far end of the hall, with 2 senior wolves flanking him and wearing no ceremonial decoration beyond the black cloak and the single silver clasp at the throat that she was already beginning to recognize as his customary mark. The room changed when he entered it, not loudly, not through any dramatic shift in sound or movement. But every wolf in that assembly straightened fractionally, oriented fractionally, the involuntary response of bodies that understood, below the level of thought, what kind of authority had entered the room. He crossed to the platform and took his seat without ceremony, and then, before the assembly formally opened, his eyes moved across the room once, a single slow sweep, and stopped on her. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Not long, but deliberate. The kind of 3 seconds that are not incidental, that have been decided upon before the moment arrives. Then he looked forward, and the assembly began. Molly realized she had been holding her breath, and quietly released it. Beside her, a woman she didn't know leaned slightly closer and murmured, "He has never looked at the side gallery during an opening. Not once in 12 years. Molly said nothing. But she felt the warmth of the southern tower room settle again into her chest, in the place where the ember had been, and understood that whatever she was trying to hold loosely was becoming heavier by the hour. The assembly addressed territorial boundaries, resource agreements between the northern packs, and a formal recognition of a new alpha in the West March territory. Molly paid attention to all of it, because the world it revealed was one she had only known from the outside, and she found it more intricate and more human than the distance had suggested. She was still watching when the final item was raised. It was Sina's father who raised it, Alpha Varthon, a broad man with silver at his temples, and the particular confidence of someone who had never needed to question his own standing. He rose from his seat with the ease of a man accustomed to the floor. "There is a matter of the king's succession," he said. "The court has been patient. The Eastern Pacts have made their inquiries through formal channels. We would ask, with respect, that the king address the question of a mate and an heir before the next seasonal assembly." The room was very still. Adrian looked at Varthon with an expression that was entirely unreadable. "The matter?" Adrian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without effort. "Is already being addressed." Varthon paused. "By what means?" Adrian's eyes moved across the room again, and this time they did not stop at 3 seconds. They stopped on Molly, and stayed. The entire assembly turned to follow his gaze. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture and weight, the kind that means an entire room is revising what it thought it understood. Molly sat very straight in the deep blue dress with the silver thread catching the torchlight, and did not look away from him, because she was 23 years old and had spent enough of her life looking away, and she had decided, somewhere between the courtyard and the corridor, and the silver window light of a room with a fireplace that worked, that she was finished with that particular habit too. The assembly did not immediately dissolve into chaos. It came close. Alpha Varthon remained standing for several seconds after Adrian's gaze had made its meaning clear, with the expression of a man whose prepared speech had been rendered entirely irrelevant, and who was deciding in real time how to respond to that. Around the semicircle, wolves shifted in their seats with the contained energy of a room full of people who had strong reactions and the political sense to keep them internal, at least temporarily. Sina Varthon, in her father's section, had gone very still. Rowan, near the platform, was looking at the ceiling with an expression of profound serenity. Emmett was watching Molly with open assessment, the focused attention of someone running calculations, and after a moment he gave a single small nod that felt, somehow, like a verdict. Adrian rose from his chair. The room quieted immediately, the way rooms quiet when the person standing is the kind of person who does not need to ask for silence. "The assembly is concluded," he said. "Senior delegates will remain for private counsel. All others are dismissed." It was not a request. The hall began to clear with the orderly efficiency of wolves who understood a direct command. Molly rose with the general movement, uncertain whether she was included in the dismissal or the remaining, and found Petra materializing beside her, with the quiet purposefulness that was apparently the woman's defining characteristic. "You'll stay," Petra said. Molly stayed. When the hall had emptied to the senior delegates, perhaps 15 wolves in total, and the doors had been drawn closed, the quality of the room changed entirely. The formality lifted the way weather lifts after rain, and what remained was something more direct and considerably less comfortable for several of those present. Varthon spoke first. "My lord." His tone was measured, but the measure was an effort, with respect. "The woman is unknown to this court. She carries no pack, no rank, no territorial standing. The question of succession, Adrian said, and his voice had not changed in volume but had changed in weight, dropping into a register that made the stone walls seem to pay attention, has been raised by this court for 12 years. I have heard it 12 years. Tonight, I am answering it." "You are answering it with someone no one has heard of," Varthon said. His control was good but not perfect. "The Eastern Pax will not accept." "The Eastern Pax," Rowan said pleasantly from his position near the wall, "accept what the Alpha King decides. That is, in fact, the foundational principle of this entire assembly. I believe it's in the original charter if anyone wants to check." Varthon looked at Rowan with an expression that suggested he found him deeply unhelpful. "I am not asking the Eastern Pax to accept anything tonight," Adrian said, with the quiet finality of someone who had already decided how this ended and was being patient with the process of others arriving at the same conclusion. "I am informing this council of my intention. The formal process will follow in the appropriate order." He looked at Molly then, directly, across the half-empty hall, and the look said, "Come here." Not a command. The same thing he had done in the corridor, the night before, with the word "stay." A request delivered by someone who was not accustomed to making them and was doing it anyway, carefully, as if he was still learning the shape of the gesture. Molly walked forward. She was aware of every eye in the room. She was aware of Sina's gaze, which had a specific quality she could feel without looking directly at it, the focused heat of someone watching something they had wanted be given to someone else. She was aware of Varthon's assessment, and the quieter, more neutral assessments of the other delegates. She walked until she was a few paces from Adrian, and stopped. Up close, in the full light of the hall rather than torchlight or corridor shadow, he was more present than she had processed from a distance. The dark eyes were steady on her face with the same expression she had catalogued since the first moment in the corridor. Recognition. Certainty. Something that looked like the particular relief of a man who has been looking for something without knowing he was looking, and has found it. "I should have asked you first," he said quietly, for her alone. "Before the assembly. I should have asked." Molly held his gaze. "Yes, you should have." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, the same not quite smile she had seen before, but it reached his eyes this time in a way it hadn't previously, and it changed his face in a way that made him look, briefly, like someone younger and considerably less armored. "I am asking now," he said. "Whatever this becomes, whatever the process requires. I am asking if you are willing." The hall was silent enough that the torches were audible. Molly thought about the carriage and the iron gates and the dress she had sewn by candlelight. She thought about the corridor and the cold, and her own shoulders held deliberately back. She thought about the ember and the silver window light and the fireplace that worked. She thought about 3 seconds of held gaze across an assembly hall, and a man who apparently had not looked at the side gallery in 12 years. She thought about her father on the border, who had told her once in the particular quiet of a winter morning that the most important things in a life are the ones that ask for you specifically, not for a role you fill or a use you serve, for you. "I'm willing," she said. The formal proceedings took the remainder of the season. There were rituals, and they were completed. There were territorial acknowledgments, and they were made. There were 3 separate delegations that arrived at Veldmoor with formal objections rooted in politics and bloodline concerns, and the general conservatism of powerful wolves who distrust change, and each of them left having been received with courtesy and answered with the quiet immovability that was, Molly was learning, Adrian's defining mode of operation. Varthon was the last to formally withdraw his objection. He did it in a private meeting with Adrian that lasted the better part of a morning, and when he emerged, his expression was that of a man who had argued well and lost fairly, which was its own kind of respect. He nodded to Molly in the corridor outside the meeting room as he passed, a single nod that was brief and genuine, and carried more acknowledgement than anything he had said in the assembly hall. Sina left Veldmoor with her father's delegation without speaking to Molly directly. On the morning of their departure, crossing the inner courtyard where the carriages were being loaded, she paused near Molly for a moment that felt deliberate. "You should know," Sina said, with the careful tone of someone choosing honesty over performance, "that I knew about you. Before last night, Dorian had mentioned you." Molly waited. "He said you were no one important," Sina said. "I believed him." A pause. "I won't make that mistake again about anyone." She walked on toward the carriage, and Molly watched her go, and thought that Sina Varthon was probably going to be formidable in whatever direction she chose to apply herself, and that the world would find that out sooner rather than later. Dorian she did not see again. His delegation had left before the assembly concluded, and the Grey Pine Pack sent a formal letter of recognition through the appropriate channels 2 months later, worded with the particular careful neutrality of people managing an awkward situation, with as much dignity as the situation allowed. Molly read it once, and set it aside, and did not read it again. Cora stayed. This had not been discussed as much as it had simply become true, the way certain things become true when the shape of a life changes, and the people who fit genuinely into it remain, and the ones who don't find their own natural direction. Cora was given a position in the court's household administration, where her organizational intelligence and her complete immunity to being impressed by rank made her immediately and somewhat legendarily effective. Within 2 months, 3 senior court officials had discovered that things ran more smoothly when they didn't question her methods. Rowan called her terrifying, with the full warmth of someone who considered this a high compliment. Emmett simply stayed out of her way, which he claimed was tactical. The bonding ceremony was held on the first warm night of spring, in the inner courtyard where the frost had been silver on the morning Molly had crossed it, and told Dorian she hoped his alliance served his pack well. The courtyard was lit with iron lanterns, and the scent of the night was green and alive, new growth coming up between the old stones. The senior wolves of 12 packs were present, their crests and banners hanging still in the warm air. Adrian stood at the center with the particular stillness that was his, and when Molly walked toward him across the courtyard, he watched her the way he had watched her in the corridor on the first night, with recognition, with certainty, with something that had only deepened over the months between that night and this one. She had not worn the snow-white dress. That dress was folded carefully in the chest at the foot of the bed in the southern tower, and she understood that she would keep it always, not as a symbol of what had gone wrong, but as evidence of what she had been willing to make with her own hands, and what she had been willing to believe was possible, on a night when she had very little reason to believe anything at all. The dress she wore tonight was the deep blue one, the color of the sky in the last moment before full dark, with the silver thread catching the lantern light. When she reached him, he took her hand, and the gesture was simple and entirely unperformed. The gesture of someone who had decided, and was not interested in pretending he hadn't. "Still willing?" he said quietly. "Still willing," she said. The ritual words were spoken by the court elder, and the bonds were witnessed by 12 packs, and a courtyard full of iron lanterns, and one spring night that smelled of green things growing in old stone. Rowan, standing to Adrian's left, managed to maintain a dignified expression for approximately the entire ceremony, which was a personal record. Emmett, to his credit, maintained a dignified expression completely, and only ruined it slightly by the expression he made at Rowan afterward. Cora stood in the courtyard with her hands folded, and her eyes very bright, and when the ceremony concluded, she was the first person Molly looked for, and finding her was the particular relief of being seen by someone who had known you before you knew yourself. In the years that followed, Veldmore changed in ways that were gradual and then undeniable. The court became a place where the border territories felt they had a voice, because their alpha queen had come from the edges, and carried that knowledge in her without apology. The healing work that Molly had begun in small ways, out of habit, and the memory of old Sable's teachings, grew into something larger, a proper healing house within the court walls, staffed and supplied, and eventually sought out by wolves from territories 3 days' ride away. Adrian governed as he always had, with the quiet immovability that had defined him, but those who knew him well could see the difference. There was something less sealed about him, something that had been held tightly for a long time, that had been, gradually and completely, released. Rowan remained. He was constitutionally incapable of leaving anywhere interesting, and Veldmore, he maintained, had become considerably more interesting. Emmett remained. He had opinions about the kitchen's seasonal menu that he felt were underrepresented in court policy, and he intended to see this corrected. Cora remained and ran half the court's administration with the efficient serenity of someone who had found exactly the work she was meant to do and intended to do it thoroughly. On a winter morning, 4 years after the bonding ceremony, Molly sat in the window seat of the southern tower, with the silver light coming in at its familiar angle, and her hands resting still in her lap, and felt the particular deep quiet of a life that had arrived somewhere true. Not perfect. Lives were not perfect. There were difficult seasons and hard decisions, and the constant complex work of governing a territory that contained multitudes. There were mornings when the old weight of the corridor tried to visit, the memory of the snow-white dress, and the relief on Dorian's face, and the cold stone walls. On those mornings she let the memory come and let it go, because it had led her here, and here was real and warm and entirely hers. Adrian came to find her, as he did on most mornings, and sat beside her in the window seat with the ease of someone who had learned, over time, to be still without armor. His hand found hers without ceremony. Outside, the courtyard was white with frost. The iron lanterns from the bonding night were still there, hanging between the arches, empty now but permanent, because no one had suggested removing them, and no one would. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. The frost on the stones was silver in the early light, and the world was very quiet, and it was enough. It was, she thought,